The ground beneath your feet is rarely as solid as it seems, especially when that ground has been marked by a divine ultimatum. Imagine a city where the very air tasted of excess, and the stones of the walls hummed with a defiance that reached the heavens, only to be silenced in a single, agonizing heartbeat of fire and sulfur. This is the shadow of Sodom and Gomorrah, a place where the line between human depravity and celestial judgment was blurred until it was eventually erased by a rain of burning stone. But think about this for a second. We often treat these accounts as dusty Sunday school lessons or metaphors for morality, yet the physical reality of what happened in that valley was far more visceral and terrifying than any storybook could capture. The Jordan River Valley was once a lush, emerald paradise, described as being like the garden of the Lord, a place of such immense wealth and agricultural power that it drew the eyes of kings and nomads alike. It was a jewel of the ancient world, pulsing with life, trade, and an arrogance that grew alongside its prosperity. Here is where it becomes unsettling. The silence that now hangs over the Dead Sea is not natural. It is a heavy, chemical silence that feels like the aftermath of a crime scene that has been frozen in salt for 4 millennia. Imagine standing on the edge of a plain where nothing grows, where the water is so thick with minerals that it chokes the life out of anything that touches it, and realizing that this was once the most fertile land on the planet. The transition from a paradise to a salt-choked wasteland didn't happen over millions of years of climate change. It happened in a morning. And this is the part most people miss. The destruction wasn't just about what the people were doing in their private homes, but about a systemic, cold-hearted rejection of the basic laws of human mercy. The biblical text and ancient traditions describe a society that had become so insulated by its own wealth that it viewed the poor and the traveler not just with indifference, but with a calculated, predatory cruelty. They had built a city that was a fortress of the self, where the cries of the oppressed were drowned out by the music of the feast, creating a spiritual frequency that finally demanded a response from the Creator. Describe the sensation of that final evening when the sun began to dip behind the mountains of Moab, casting long, purple shadows over a city that had no idea its clock had run out. The streets were likely crowded, the air filled with the scent of roasted meats and expensive oils, while just outside the gates, 3 figures approached with a message that would tear the sky apart. There was a peculiar stillness in the atmosphere, the kind of heavy, electric tension that precedes a massive storm. Yet the citizens continued their revelry, convinced that their walls were thick enough to keep out the divine. But think about this for a second. When the messengers arrived, the response of the city wasn't one of curiosity or even typical hostility, but an immediate, unanimous surge of darkness. The mob that surrounded the house of Lot wasn't a group of criminals, but the entire population, from the youngest to the oldest, acting with a single twisted mind. It was the moment the scale tipped. It was the moment when a city proved that it had lost the very essence of what makes a human being a reflection of the divine, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell of appetites. Here is where it becomes unsettling. The Bible describes the destruction as brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, a phrase that carries a weight of sheer, localized power. Imagine the sky turning a bruised, unnatural black, not from clouds, but from an atmosphere that was literally igniting. The sound wouldn't have been a simple thunderclap, but a sustained, deafening roar of a furnace opening up directly above your head. The very soil, rich in bitumen and sulfur, would have turned into liquid fire, rising up to meet the flames falling from above. Deep expansion allows us to zoom in on Lot's family as they were dragged by their hands toward the mountains, told not to look back at the world they were leaving behind. The heat at their backs must have been blistering, a physical force that pushed them forward, while the ground vibrated with the screams of a dying civilization. Every instinct in the human body screams to look at the source of a loud noise, to witness the spectacle of one's own life being erased, yet they were commanded to keep their eyes on the horizon. And this is the part most people miss. When Lot's wife turned to look back, it wasn't just a moment of curiosity, it was a moment of lingering soul attachment to a place that had already been judged. The text says she became a pillar of salt, a haunting, crystalline monument to the danger of looking back at what God had told you to leave behind. Imagine the terror of her daughters, hearing her footsteps stop, only to find a statue of white minerals where her mother had stood seconds before, her eyes forever fixed on the smoke rising from the plain. Sensory immersion brings us to the morning after, when Abraham stood on a distant ridge and looked down into the valley. He didn't see the sparkling cities or the green fields he had known. Instead, he saw a thick, oily smoke rising from the earth like the smoke of a giant kiln. The silence that followed the fire was absolute. There were no birds, no wind in the trees, no distant voices of children, just the crackle of cooling ash and the suffocating smell of sulfur that would linger in the soil for thousands of generations. But think about this for a second. Archaeologists today have found layers of ash and melted pottery in the region that suggest a heat so intense that it turned brick into glass in an instant. They describe a thermal event that leveled structures and vaporized everything in its path, leaving behind a chemical signature that matches the biblical description perfectly. Whether it was a cosmic airburst or a direct supernatural strike, the result remains the same. A total, irreversible erasure of a culture that thought it was untouchable. Here is where it becomes unsettling. The Bible describes the destruction as pushing the fingers at others, but its truest purpose is to hold a mirror up to us. It asks what happens to a civilization when it stops hearing the cries of the vulnerable. It asks what happens when our mercy is replaced by our mirrors. The fire wasn't just a punishment, it was a cleaning. It was a hard reset for a land that had been choked by the weeds of its own making. And this is the part most people miss. The ruins of these cities aren't just historical curiosities, they're a living prophecy. They serve as a permanent reminder that there is a limit to how much darkness a land can hold before the light must intervene. The ash beneath the salt of the Dead Sea whispers a warning to every generation that follows that the height of our skyscrapers and the strength of our economies are no defense against a moral rot that hollows us out from the inside. As the sun sets today over that same desolate valley, the salt pillars still stand and the water remains heavy of the ghost of a paradise lost. The lesson isn't just about fire, but about the urgency of looking forward toward the palace of the heart rather than back at the pits of our past. We're invited to remember Sodom, not to dwell on the destruction, but to realize that we are currently standing on the same ground, making the same choices, and breathing the same air that once ignited into a divine flame. The true mystery isn't why God burned the city, but why we so often find ourselves standing at the edge of the same fire, wondering if we should take one last look back. We are the survivors of a story that is still being written, walking the thin line between the mercy of the morning and the judgment of the night. The smoke has cleared, but the heat remains, a quiet vibration in the earth that tells us the story of the city that burned is never truly over as long as we inhabit its streets.